So around 20 years ago, a friend of mine embarked on a really weird journey. At least I thought it was pretty weird. He grew up as a Italian Catholic, and then he told me he's going to explore different religions. I said, okay, fair enough. He said, no, 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 no. I'm going to convert to each of these different religions. I said, and you're an Italian Catholic, right? Okay. And he said, yeah, no, I'm going to be a Jew, then a Muslim, then a Baha'i, or whatever, and see where it goes. And I thought that was a really curious thing to do. I had never heard of anybody doing that. Certainly exploring different religions is great, but he plunged in with both his feet. So that began my own journey as well. Then after that, I started to explore in university different traditions. No, I didn't convert or become different things necessarily, but I was really curious. So he was pivotal in helping me understand that, that we can explore different things and learn from that. And so I, in addition to accumulating a lot of spiritual light bulb jokes, such as how many Christians does it take to change a light bulb? 3, but they are really only 1. How many Zen Buddhists does it take to change a light bulb? 3, again. 1 to change the light bulb, 1 not to change the light bulb, and 1 to do neither of what the other 2 are doing as well. I did learn a few other things on that path too, not just silly light bulb jokes as well. And I want to share with you kind of this whirlwind tour. I know we only have 30 minutes, but 20 years of exploring 4 predominant paths. My root tradition is Sufi Sunni. So Sufi is the mystical arm of a tradition called Sunni, which is Islam. And that's what I grew up in, both in Europe as well as in the Middle East and then in Canada. And I still remain true to that. And it's something that speaks deeply to me as well. And then from there, I started to explore Hinduism, Vedic Vedanta philosophy and the like, and then Taoism, and now Buddhism as well. So this past weekend, our merry band of Sufi groups, Sufi people, explorers, got to perform the Sema, the whirling dervish. So we have a Sufi teacher here in Atlanta, and for 20, 30 years, he's actually been performing this turn. I think many of you have probably heard or seen, and it is a form of meditation in our Sufi tradition, particularly a Sufi tradition inspired by the great poet Rumi. Many of you have heard of Rumi poems and so on. And in fact, today is a really important day, December 17th in 1273 Christian era, Rumi passed on. And so today, in fact, is the day in which we honor his marriage with the beloved, as we call it, his merger with the divine. And Sufis, there are, let me see if I can, there is something I want to show you here. Can I bring up the YouTube video as well? Okay, let's see if I click on that link. Maybe if you can play that link. There we go. What you're hearing is an instrument called the ney. And this is something I've been learning for some time, but I will not torment you with my playing. So instead you get to hear a professional player. And the ney is kind of a call. It's a truly empty instrument, absolutely hollow. If you blow into it, you will hear no sound whatsoever. There is no reed. There's nothing. So what is it that makes the sound? You have to hollow yourself and become the reed in that process. And through that are these amazing sounds that you're hearing. And in Sufi, we have a lot of such metaphors. So what I'd like to share with you are some of the lessons I've learned from these traditions. What are the goals, quote unquote, what are some of the key highlights from each of these? And maybe at the end, tie it together a little bit in this journey of 20 plus years. What have I really learned about this? What connects all of this together? So in the Sufi turn, I was turning on Sunday, in fact, and for almost 45 minutes, we have various turns that we do so. And at one point, I closed my eyes, and it's as if the whole world stood still. So this turn is a metaphor for everything in the universe is always in movement, always in orbit, always in oscillation. But yet within that, we can find the stillness. And that is what the Sufi is yearning for, to find the stillness while completely in movement. The two are not contradictory. That is life. You know, life is movement, life is journey, life is explorations. But through that, we can also find the stillness. And so the Sufi goal in the languages used in Sufi tradition are Persian, Urdu, Arabic, Turkish, and various other ones too. Fana means self-annihilation, losing of that self, absorbing of that self, where the self, ego, or individual identity dissolves into the divine, into the beloved. There's a lot of metaphors in Sufi where they say, Ishq Allah, Muhammad Allah, the lover and that which is loving and that which is beloved are all one and the same. They become united. And so that is the goal in Sufi tradition. And there are various practices. Just like in Buddhism, there are forms of meditation. There are many schools of Sufi, over 12, 20 in fact, Naqshbandi, Chisti, and many others. And they all have different forms of meditation, but they do share very much in common this kind of journey, tariqah, which means the journey, and hakikat, which is the exploration of the truth, and finally marifat, which is merger with the divine, bliss, if you will, sometimes called ananda in Hindu circles, but we'll get to that in a moment. So that is, the zikr is the key meditation, and it literally means, it's an Arabic word, or Persian, and it means remembrance. Remembrance of what? Remembrance that you are ultimately the divine. Interesting. You are not the ego. You are not the self. That what you are, your essence, is no different than that of everybody else. And for a Sufi, they say, just like in Buddhists, ignorance is the ultimate problem. We have forgotten what we really are. And ultimately, we are to remember what we are, and that's what zikr is. So all of this, the repetition, the chanting, is towards remembering who you really are. There's a lot of intentional breath work and ultimately integration in Sufi. During university, so that was my root tradition, that's what I grew up with. And then during university, after being inspired by my friend Robert Bianchi, who's now an international professor in the Middle East about religions and world comparative linguistics, I ran into this book called The Tao of Physics. So I chose to go into the sciences. My background is applied physics and electrical engineering. And I was always fascinated about how does the world work? I wanted to really tangibly understand what the world is about. Yes, the mysticism is great, but I really want to understand the laws of physics, thermodynamics, Maxwell's equations, whatever it is I wanted to explore. I ran into this book called The Tao of Physics by a physics professor and a researcher called Fritjof Capra. And he talked about the integration of science and spirituality. And he said, Eastern thought has similar understanding of reality, such as the interconnectedness of all things and the unity of matter and energy. And that spoke to me a lot. It's like, wow, this is really cool. What's this about? And then in it, he explores Hinduism, he explores Buddhism, he explores Taoism, and several mystic thoughts, particularly from the East. So his notion is that these things, these paths from the East have something to teach us, even in modern quantum science, quantum mechanics and so on. And he had 6 suggestions for a new paradigm of science. Consider the part and the whole as symmetrically conditioning one another. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? There's a tight integration between that. Think in terms of, replace thinking in terms of structure, in terms of process. So rather than just discretely dividing everything, understand the process in which it is going through. Once again, connectedness between things. Replace objective science with epistemic science, meaning the subjective experience can become just as important as the objective experience. Wow, okay, that's kind of interesting. Replace the idea of knowledge as building on a base of foundations with the idea of knowledge as networks. And what are we facing now? What are we experiencing now? Networks. We are what is but AI, but the connection of networks, connection of the relationship between all this knowledge, right? So and this was done in 1971, I think is when he published this book. And then abandon the quest for truth with the quest for better approximations. Not sure I quite understand that one yet. And then finally, abandon the ideas of domination of nature with one of cooperation and nonviolence. Yeah, so that really, really spoke to me a lot, in fact. And I continued my studies in physics and engineering and so on, to the point that now I work in renewable energy, and I finally made the shift in working on large power plants and systems that are fully sustainable. And that was my passion for quite some time. So from that, I started to explore Hinduism. That's a kind of a collective term. What exactly is Hinduism? It's hard to pin down. I prefer to use the word Vedic Vedanta, right, which is more like the philosophy rather than just the rituals of Hinduism and all other things associated with it. And one of the key philosophies in Vedic Vedanta is something called Advaita, which means non-dualism. This is starting to sound awfully familiar with something that we are familiar with here as well. So in Vedic Vedanta, particularly Advaita, what I discovered is moksha, or liberation, is the goal. Well, what's that? That sounds awfully similar to fana, which in the Sufi was about self-annihilation or absorption with the infinite. So here it is to realize and manifest one's own divinity. The ultimate reality, these are all Sanskrit terms here, right, from India. Brahman is one with the individual self, Atman. The jiva, the Atman, is identical with it. And so the perceived world is a projection or an illusion. Maya is the term that is used in Vedic Vedanta, Advaita philosophy. And they have a series of practices through which, such as yoga, there's jnana yoga, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, and raja yoga, amongst many others. And these yoga, the word yoga itself, as I learned, means union, to yoke, to merge. So a process in which you can practice, in which you can yoke with the infinite, with the divine, Brahman, as it's called in Hinduism. And as you realize that, then you realize thou art that, tattvam asi, or neti neti. You are neither this nor that, but you are everything. So I love this quote right here. There is neither death nor birth, neither a bound nor a struggling soul, neither a seeker after liberation nor a liberated one. There is only the ultimate truth. Sri Shankara. This idea of non-dualism kind of struck a chord with me. And one of the key books, and I have that here too, is called the Bhagavad Gita. right? And that's the core of the essence of a lot of Vedic Vedanta teaching. There's the Vedas, there's the Upanishads, many, many, many books as well, just like in Buddhist circles there's Pali Canon and many other things. What I found, not this book, sorry. Oh, I did not bring it actually, sorry. This Tao Te Ching. What I found is that these books were really short. And that was really cool, because I can be a bit of a lazy reader, so I love really, really short books. So the Bhagavad Gita is a really small book, part of a much larger book called the Mahabharata, which is enormous. But the core teachings could be summarized very shortly, as you'll find when we get to Taoism, and in Buddhism too, the Dhammapada, and so on. I love this quote from the Bhagavad Gita. For a beginner in yoga, the path is work. For one advanced in yoga, the path is stillness of mind. Wonderful. Without getting too much into the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, which again means non-dualism, the word a in Sanskrit, or the pronoun, prefix, if you will, as often means opposite. So ahimsa means opposite of violence or non-violence. And Advaita is non-dualism. Vaitya is dualism, Advaita. And here they talk about we are in the world of Atman and it dravyas. In other words, a world of multiplicity. And through that, we can realize the world of duality, which the next level up through practices such as yoga and so on. And then ultimately, we realize the soul reality, that there is no separation. There is no duality. And that, as you go up on this chart, then you realize the non-dualism of everything, the connectedness, the unity in everything itself. So starting to see a kind of a trend here, right? Kind of a pattern. So here I was in Sufism, and then I was in, again, I didn't convert or anything, but I was exploring. So I actually went to these countries. I went to Turkey to witness where Rumi had died, Konya, and to learn and understand it a little bit more. Then I went to India, to the ashrams, and to meditate there, and to talk with the gurus, Sai Baba, Sadhguru, several others, and say, hey, tell me more, teach me more about this. Shivananda's ashram in a place in the north is a really cool place. It's in a town called Rishikesh, up north of Delhi. Highly recommend it. So it was really cool to go there and just spend a week meditating in the ashrams and talking with some of the teachers there. So I continued that, and then I went to China, and I was really drawn by Chinese philosophy and said, oh, well, this is great. I mean, I've got a decent understanding of Middle Eastern philosophy, Persian and Pakistan and so on, and now into India. So where, if you keep going east from there, where are you going to go to? But to China, right? And there was a bit more difficult because it was harder to find those core teachings because they've often have been obscured after Maoist Cultural Revolution and so on. But, I persisted and went to Singapore as well to learn a little bit more about those teachings there. And so I ran into something called Taoism, okay? And Taoism was like, oh, this is a core teaching within China itself. And what is that about? Inner peace, contentment, and harmony with the natural flow of the universe. That is the Tao. Oh, the Tao. I'm confused. I still don't understand exactly what Tao is. And then I started to read the book, Tao Te Ching, and the very first line was, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. It's like, man, this is not helping me, right? And then it started to dawn on me. Yes, it is the fabric that permeates everything. It is not something on which you can put a label on or put a note. Tao is the flow. It is the very infrastructure, if you will, of the entire universe. And Tao is thought. Balance is emphasized in, you've seen the symbol, the Taiji Tu, the yin and the yang. So that's a symbol of duality, the yin and the yang, and so on. And you see the enneagrams or whatever, not enneagrams, sorry, there's a term for this, I forgot. And they emphasize effortless action. There's a quote in the Tao Te Ching, be like water, ever so strong, yet so fluid as well. We create a jug, a vase from matter, but it is the emptiness that holds what we want. We create a room with walls, but it is the hollowness, the emptiness that holds what is that we want. We create a wheel from spokes, but it is the hollow hub that makes it go around. We create from matter, but it is non-matter that we use. So it was like, wow, this is really curious. And so I started to practice a little bit more Qigong, Tai Chi. These are forms of meditation, if you will, within Taoist thought. And the three treasures of Taoism is compassion, moderation, and humility. This symbol, the yin and the yang, is actually part of a much greater symbol. You'll see from the top to the bottom there. The top there is absolute emptiness. It is the oneness, beyond the duality. But from the oneness of emptiness, the pregnant emptiness, came the duality, which is the next symbol down below, as you can see with the red dot. From that came the five kind of paths, or five virtues, and so on. And then from that you have multiplicity, the union on heaven and earth, which is symbolized by the circle below that. And below the very last circle is a circle of multiplicity. That is, we live in the realm of 10,000 things. So you may hear that term. And our journey is to, within that realm, to ultimately get to beyond even duality, into complete unity. And that's what Taoism believes. The very word Tao Te Ching, which I've written in the Mandarin right here, Tao means way or path, principle. Te is virtue. This is in ancient Mandarin. Power, integrity. And Jing is classic or scripture. So it is the classic scripture of the way of virtue and power. That is Tao Te Ching. And again, a very short book. So you could read, literally, a lot of these philosophical books in a weekend or in an afternoon. Understanding them takes a full lifetime. But it's really cool that the teachers wrote very little. Actually, they wrote a lot. But the core essence of a lot of these teachings can be summarized very shortly. Then, from there, I went to Thailand and to Sri Lanka, and to other places as well, and started to explore more what's called Theravada Buddhism, the tradition of the elders, the forest way, or, and some consider perhaps the closest to the Buddha's original teachings. And I ran into a book, a translation of a book called the Dhammapada by a Sri Lankan author, Maitri Ananda. Brilliant translation into English. And again, 26 paragraphs of the teachings, of core teachings of Buddhism summarized in the Dhammapada, which is teachings at the foot of the master. So this was written in Pali, which is a language allied, if you will, with Sanskrit, and some consider maybe the Buddha himself spoke in that language, but there's some contention about that. Regardless, it was the language of the commoners. So what's the goal in Buddhism, if you will? And I say goal in quotes, of course. Enlightenment, bodhi, leading to nirvana, a state of profound peace and wisdom through samadhi and various other practices. Liberation from suffering, dukkha, so suffering, the Four Noble Truths that you guys are aware of, the truth of suffering, and the cycle and the liberation from the cycle of rebirth, samsara. So this is achieved by eliminating the kleshas, what they call ignorance, greed, and hatred or anger. Understanding reality, the impermanence of things, non-self, and cultivating compassion and wisdom, and following the Eightfold Noble Paths. So now I'm going to present to you this eye chart of all the different, I can see some of you straining on this already. I discovered this relatively recently, but as I started to explore the different Buddhist schools, from Theravada, also Mahayana, and then Tibetan schools, Vajrayana as well. So I was kind of wondering, like, wow, what is all of this? And these are the three schools: Theravada, the tradition of the elders, or the forest tradition, and of which you can see the Dhammakaya movement here listed as well, which to some extent also merges some Mahayana principles and what's called Bodhisattva principles as well, with practical action. So Theravada was very much a little bit stricter and very much some consider closer to the teachings about let's focus on what really matters. Let's work on the self before everything else, arhat, let's realize the truth of nature things, and so on. Mahayana chose a little bit of a different path. Of course, the core is true through all of them, in which they said, oh, well, let's work on the alleviating the suffering of others as well, something called the Bodhisattva ideal. And you can see there are many, many Mahayana schools. One in which I'm involved with the Dharma Jewel is a Zen school, or Chan, from Taiwan or China. So I tried telling that light bulb joke there. It didn't go too far, actually, but that's all right. I'm working on them. So Mahayana literally means great vehicle. Maha, like Mahabharata or Mahatma Gandhi or so on. And then there's yet another one, which the Dalai Lama, Gelugpa school, I believe it is, the Yellow Hats, and that's the Diamond or Thunderbolt vehicle. Sounds like a really cool vehicle to drive in, I guess. So I wonder if it's electric powered. Yeah, with Thunderbolt it would be, yes. So the idea there in Vajrayana is that you can harness all the energies that you have, all the creative, the sexual, tantra, whatever it is, to achieve enlightenment in one lifetime. Okay, I'm not saying this is true or whatever, but it's kind of interesting. So as I started to explore that, there's a lot of visuality in that. There's a lot of mantras and tantras and so on in Vajrayana. That was kind of interesting and very cool as well. And so there are various Vajrayana schools, too, that you guys know about. And the key book in all of this, as I mentioned, which is common to all of them, is the Dhammapada. And you know the very first line, mind is the forerunner of everything. As is your mind, so goes everything else. And there's more as well. I'm not going to necessarily read it right now, but again, the emphasis is on mind or heart, if you will. But mind, your state of mind, your awareness, the consciousness you bring to all of this is the precursor to everything and what determines your life. And hence, that is why we literally meditate. And one thing I really began to appreciate in Buddhism, which again I appreciate many things in all the traditions, is that it was more essential in terms of working on the mind directly. And again, this is not to say Buddhism is better in its practices than the others, because there's a role for all of them. But one thing I really appreciated is the techniques and the skills of working directly with the mind, which I saw as really integral in Buddhism. So now we come to the end of this journey. It's 8:29, and I know this is a whirlwind tour of so much, right? What have I come to realize? Maybe 4 key points through all of this. And that is, a lot of these paths, which I deeply appreciate and continue to practice, is that it's a personal journey. Everyone's mileage will differ. In fact, it should differ. It is not about conformity, not about complying to what somebody has said, but rather you got to figure it out yourself. In fact, it is reputed that the Buddha's last words, presumably, and you guys can correct me, it says, "O Ananda, realize that all things decay, all things are transient. Seek salvation on your own merits." In other words, it's up to you, buddy. You got to figure it out. I'm here, I laid the path, but you got to put in the work, you got to do it through the practices that I've taught you. The other thing is transcendence and the absorption of the self, that the self is not a fixed entity. We have different aspects of that self, but ultimately our goal, quote unquote, is to transcend this notion of projected self. And that I found common in all of these traditions, whether Sufism or Taoism or Buddhism, all 3 schools, or Vedic Vedanta, Advaita, and so on. Third is ethics and a way of life. You know, we talk about Gen, right? Generosity, ethics, meditation. I'm preempting you asking me what this might stand for. but ethics, in other words, practice. How do we relate to each other? What are we doing in our practices? Not just by ourselves, but how do we interact with each other? And what sort of society are we looking to create? Because we have to do it together. And that is emphasized in all of these traditions, especially the Eastern traditions. And finally, a meditation practice of some sort, whether it's yoga, we call it jnana yoga, raja yoga, karma yoga, whether it's the zikr in Sufi circles, whether it's qigong, tai chi, whether it's jiva meditation, whatever it is a form of self-growth, inquiry, and practice. And that is key. So these are the four things I've come to realize that tie together a lot of these practices. And I'm not saying it's not true for other mystical practices like Kabbalah, which I have not explored in Judaism, or Gnostic Christianity also has mystical practices as well. And absolutely, if you are so inclined, please go and explore those as well. But this has been my particular journey. So I'll leave you with a poem by Rumi, seeing that today is the day in which Rumi passed. And it's the very opening line of his preeminent work called the Masnavi, or Rhyming Couplets, which is a treatise on life, on a mystical life, and a life well lived. And I'll just quote a few lines from Persian and then translate to English. Beshna az nechun hekayot mikonad, az judai ha shikayat mikonad, kaz neestan ta mera bobride and. Listen to the reed and hear how it complains and tells a tale of suffering's pains. Ever since I was cut from the reed bed, my lament has caused man and woman to moan. I want a bosom torn by separation to explain the pain of longing, for all those who are far from the source long to be united with it again. Thank you.